hopping on. We're going to give it a moment or two for everyone to find their Zoom links, and then we'll get on started. This session will be recorded as well, so I know that's a question people tend to ask, so we will have the conversation recorded. Well, we'll get on started, and I know people will be hopping in with those Zoom links in a second. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Global Entrepreneurship Week Sacramento 2021, powered by Western Health Advantage. We're excited that you're joining us today for this panel discussion on startup board development and about how you can unlock the hidden power of startup and advisory boards. My name is Cameron Law, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Carlson Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship and the Sacramento organizer for Global Entrepreneurship Week. And I have one of my team members joining us. We have Jesse Becker-Alexander, who's one of our entrepreneurs in residence and helps lead one of our partnerships with the Fourth Wave program. The Carlson Center serves as a regional hub and platform for providing approachable and accessible entrepreneurial education, community, and support to enable startup founders of all backgrounds to explore and launch their businesses. And we're on this mission to make innovation and entrepreneurship pervasive throughout the greater Sacramento region. And with that, hopefully realizing this vision of making Sacramento a premier hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. And how we ultimately operationalize that mission and vision is we support entrepreneurs along a continuum that we call the entrepreneurial journey. And that's broken into Discover, Build, and Launch. And Global Entrepreneurship Week falls under our Discover set of programs, really creating those on-ramps for entrepreneurs to explore what the entrepreneurial pathway looks like and make connections to help them grow their businesses in the future. And we're excited to offer this workshop as part, or this panel discussion as part of the Global Entrepreneurship Week celebration. It is indeed global, so we're joining over 180 countries around the world in celebration of Global Entrepreneurship Week. And we might actually have someone from around the world joining us here, which we've seen at other events. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator and our panelists so we can jump into this wonderful conversation. So I will spotlight them after I share a little bit about them. So our moderator today is Kim Box, and she is an independent board director of American River Bank and McGrath Rental Corp, both listed on the NASDAQ. And she also serves as board chair of the National Association of Corporate Directors of NorCal chapter, and has had experience in startups with being the CEO and president of Gatekeeper Innovations, which is a local company. And then our first panelist is Cheryl Benega, who's the co-founder of Fourth Wave and managing director of Y Mohala Ventures, which is a new type of venture investment company investing in impact companies and diverse founders. Our second panelist is Kwame Onku, who's the chairman and CEO of Black Star Fund, an early stage investment fund, and Kwame serves on a number of startup boards through their investments and his own investments. And then we also have Lakesh Sakaria, who's the founding partner of Moneta Ventures and serves on a number of startups through their investments as well. And hopefully most proudly for all of them, they serve as Carlson Center advisory board members. I know that that is certainly what they most hold true and are proud of, but no, nonetheless, we're really excited to have them here to share their experience and expertise in working with startups. And without further ado, I'll turn it on over to Kim, and I will spotlight all of you in 1 second. So there's Kim Box, and then we got Cheryl Benega, and we got Kwame, And last but not least, we got Lakesh. So take it away, Kim.
All right. Thank you, Cameron. And thank you everyone for joining today. As Cameron mentioned, I'm Kim Box, and my main thing I do these days is serve on boards, both public and private, and have experience in the early stage and startup space as well, and advisory type roles. And we are very fortunate today to have this panel. I'm just so excited for the dialogue and to have these three share their wisdom. I'm just folks who are top of their game in terms of knowing and understanding what this means. And I know that many of the folks on the phone are founders or going through the process of running startups, and building a board should never be an afterthought. It should be something that's very thoughtful, and it changes over time. So we're going to hear more about this and basically get the wisdom from each of the folks on the panel. So we're going to start by I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves so you can give some context around the board work that you've done, and in your introduction, talk about boards that you've been on and what capacities, and kind of how you got on those boards, whether it was through your investment activities or some other way. And then we'll go to the next set of questions. So why don't we start? I'm going to kind of go around the panel room here. So why don't we start with Kwame?
All right, well, good afternoon, Kim, and my friends and panelists. Great to see everybody here joining from all over the country, and I'm sure a couple of folks from around the world. Again, I'm Kwame Anku, and I am the founder and CEO of Black Star Fund Venture Capital Fund, and we focus primarily on African-American-led high-growth companies right now, just in the United States. So I serve on a number of boards, Kim, both on the board of directors, right, for the startup companies, as well as an advisory board. And I also serve on the board of trustees, which they call the Board of Regents for North Central University, which is in Minneapolis. So serving on the board for a gamified giving company called Win-Win, for NFT enterprise software company called Bandwagon, which is based in South Carolina. Also on the board of Seek, which is getting a whole lot of press as of late. It's a metaverse company, and they have an incredible crypto currency explosion that's happening right now, funded by an African woman who happens to be a rocket scientist, believe it or not. So I'm on the board of directors of that company, and I've was an early investor. So I met the founder in 2016, and we invested early in 2017. So it's really those different things. I'm an advisory board for some nonprofits as well. And as Cameron said, certainly out of all of those things, it's the Carlson Center, which is the thing I'm the most proud of and gets me in the most doors, so that we're super clear. But the coolest thing about being on the board of the Carlson Center, especially most of us have been on since its inception. So to be able to see the extraordinary work that it's doing, although it's based in Sacramento, that it's doing actually nationally, and then being part of these global conversations and really having an impact is extremely rewarding. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. All right, Cheryl, why don't we go to you next?
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Cheryl Benega, and I'm the co-founder of Fourth Wave. We're an accelerator for women tech entrepreneurs, partnering with the Carlson Center. And my background on boards is really as an investor. I was with Intel Capital for many years and served as both a board member and board observer on probably over a dozen startups. I'll say some of the names. And then I've also been on some local boards, which include not only Fourth Wave, but Fantag and Synapsense. The remainder are really outside of the region, which were Incuity, Jammed App Mobile, Analog Design Automation, Monta Vista Software. Several of those did have IPOs. And again, it was, as either a role as a founder or as an investor, as I became on the startup board. So look forward to having this discussion with all of you.
All right, thanks, Cheryl. All right, Lakesh.
Thanks, Kim. And I'm Lukash Sikaria. I'm the managing partner for Manhattan Ventures. We're based in Folsom. We're an early stage VC investor and typically invest in Sacramento companies and Austin companies. Those are the two areas we geographically tend to focus in. I have been on several boards, and it's primarily through the investments. And my experience with the boards is primarily what I thought was the right thing to do at those boards and things like that. So what I share today will be just my perspective on it, but more, I don't know if that's the best practice. I don't know if that's the norm, but my first experience on being on boards was as part of investments that Mineta Ventures made. I've been CEO of a couple of companies prior to Mineta Ventures, and I reported up to the board, so I have experience from that standpoint. But most of my experience tends to be in startups, helping them as seed and Series A directors on those boards. The other thing I would say is that I do have some experience on being nonprofit.
And I'm here to help.
A
little sign in here.
No issues. So I do serve on two nonprofit boards, Carlson Center being one, and to echo what Kwame said, certainly the most important one of all the boards I serve, and then Santa Clara University Business School. So I'm on the Levi School of Business board for Santa Clara University. So I have some little bit of experience there in that sense. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I thought we'd start by talking about give a perspective from each of you on the role that the board directors play in the startup board. And, I've served the gamut of startup all the way to public company, and it's a very different experience as you journey through. And some of you have probably, I'm sure, taken companies to IPO, and as you get closer to IPO, it changes as well. But maybe we could start with how you see the board's role. And I think the folks on the phone, it's interesting to hear this because they should be thinking about that as they think about who they want on their board. But Lokesh, let's start with you on what do you see as the board's role, and if there's any stories or experiences you can share on where it's gone really well, or if there's areas of things to look out for.
No, absolutely. So I'll talk specifically about my experience of being the board member representing the lead investor, typically as a seed round or a Series A round. To me, I don't see too much difference in terms of the role there. And there, to me, the primary thing that I do as a board member is provide support to the CEO, help them think through, as they scale businesses, what they should be thinking about, right? I also see the role of being able to provide some sort of guardrails, right? So at the end of the day, we do have some fiduciary responsibilities as board members. And so from that standpoint, I think the role is to provide the guardrails so that we can keep the company progressing in the directions that the investors and employees and the customers would want the company to go towards. So there's a fiduciary part of the role, but there is a partner part of the role. In people take money from Mineta because they think we can help them in terms of scaling their companies and growing their companies. And I take that part of the role very seriously. So how do I help them, with customer connects? How do I help them with, staffing their team? What are the different ways that I can provide value to the company is the basic driver for me and being part of those boards.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
How about Cheryl? What kind of ideas or thoughts do you have on the role of the board at that stage of the company?
Yeah, I would largely echo what Lokesh said. And by the way, Lokesh, you're a wonderful board member and partner and do an amazing job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we are on a board together at Fantech. So, I've just had the, incredible pleasure of working with Cheryl on that. And she's just equally good there. So.
Thank you. But yeah, supporting, especially when we're talking about the startup phase, and Kim, thank you for doing the session for the fourth wave CEOs this past cohort. It's really important, and the startup, very much a partnership, as Lokesh said, rolling up our sleeves and helping with everything from customer acquisition to financing to strategy to reviewing the financial plans to hiring. I think a lot of what happens is we're experienced. Some of us have gray hair. I don't know, Kwame, where's your gray hair? But, we open up our networks, largely to entrepreneurs. And that's really important because, it really does take a village to build a startup. I really do believe that, similar to raising kids, that, having board members who can, bring others into the mix in all those areas and help you see where the gaps are. Entrepreneurs, of course, they have to be passionate and really close to what they're doing. And so often they're so close that they can't see some things that us as board members, which are a little bit more removed, can see. And, it's our role to kind of help them see that and then help them, adjust and fill whatever gap we may see that they have. And it is really important. Part of even what we do when we recruit for Fourth Wave is really kind of identify that communication style and chemistry between ourselves and that CEO. And I know investors do that as well, to make sure that you're going to have a good communication, dialogue, and support structure going forward.
Great. Kwame, how about you? Do you have any other thoughts or things that you've seen as an important part of the board's role at the early stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I think about it is very similar, but then I think there's some similarities. I think there's some differences, and then I think that there is. We also have to think of like purpose of the board, right? So for me, I always think of things in terms of, the what, the how, and the why. So here we're talking about, so what is the board? Okay, well, so what is that? And I think that, one of the things that Lakesh illuminated, which really goes to the what, is the guardrails, right? Because Lakesh may have a certain way of being on a board, and I may, and Cheryl and everybody, but we may be on the board today and off tomorrow. The board's always there, right? So what is the purpose of the board? And I think that is really critical, because when Lakesh talks about fiduciary responsibility and guardrails, there's a protection there to protect the founding team from itself. And there's a protection there for the other investors who don't have the access that we have on the board. Now, we don't work for them, but our interests are aligned. So when we're making decisions that's good for our funds, as responsible investors, we're also doing that for the other investors there. So let's start. So we have the what. The how, we have our differences, but it's not necessarily that my way or Cheryl's way or Lakesh's way is really better. What it's illuminating is that when you've got different board members who bring different strengths and different lenses through which they see the work, then that's how you get the best out of that guardrail system and that protective system, right? The why is on two things, right? Why are you choosing a board member, right? Or why are you allowing someone to have a board seat as an entrepreneur? And then why are we serving as board members, right? So you have to have that clarity of those things so that in my mind, you can really optimize and maximize. The only other thing I would add, which is critical in terms of my work, but I think it should be, and I counsel all startups, and my esteemed panelists may not agree, but I feel this very strongly, is that when you're talking about early stage startup company, your board members should have written checks or are planning to write checks. And I see the board early on as being co-responsible for raising money. Now, the reason I say that is not because some people will say, well, your board, it's not your job to raise money for the company. Well, but if you wrote a check, you want to make sure that they have more money than you put in it. And the reality is, if you've got more experience, which I do, why would I be putting it on the founder to go raise $3 or $4 or $5 million if they've actually never done that before? I can counsel, I can advise them. But the reality is, I wasn't particularly good at it my first couple goes around. And I wouldn't expect a founder to be, especially if they're really good at creating a product, right? And so that's, I think, for me, I always want to play that role as a board member. I want to use that filter and lens as we're considering other board members. And then later, obviously, you just get board seats because, you wrote a check for $2 million, right? You just get it. And then as a founder, you've got to negotiate that new person. But when you're early on, you can kind of handpick and choose. You want to handpick and choose the folks that are going to help you to raise money and give you credibility in the marketplace.
Maybe Kim, I
Yeah,
can
please.
add something to what Kwame said. I actually agree with Kwame 100%, and I just didn't realize it when I joined the first few boards that I said that was part of the responsibility. So I got into those companies, invested, and then I realized, I said, one of the big things that they really could use help is with fundraising. So at this point, if I think about it in terms of connects and things like that, it used to be more about connecting them with customers and employees. But now, as I look at our portfolio companies and the time I spend, it tends to be more in terms of helping them connect with investors, like Kwame said. But it's just that that was not something that I expected to be my role in the board member when I initially joined, and just fell into it.
Surprise! Checkbook. That's good. You don't want to get involved in something and then find out it's going to flame out because there wasn't the right support. So that's a really important thing at those early stage companies.
I was just gonna, Kim, I'll just add a little bit there.
Please.
It is important, in venture, as both Kwame and Lokesh pointed out, that you have multiple investors sitting around the table, because no one, as a company grows, it's going to need more capital, and no one wants to be the only one there to write the check. So that is part of how startups come to be formed, with people, as Kwame said, who are, investing and have put in, their money into the company. And so, as you choose your investors, you're choosing your board, and one other just thing I learned along the way, Lokesh was talking about learning. I know on my first few boards, I didn't have a clue either. And I had one very mature VC. He's kind of famous now, but had served years and years. And we had a very difficult decision to make. And we had a number, this was more like in a Series C kind of stage, where we had a number of different investment fund board members sitting around the table. And it was clear that there were different fund interests, as you sit around the table, because you're in different stages of investment. And he taught me, I said, Randy, how do you think about this? And he said, you know what, Cheryl, you have to do the best thing for the company. That has to be the number one choice. And that always stayed with me, because you will sit around a table with someone who maybe came in early, someone who came in late, and you have an exit opportunity, and there's just different incentives. And how do you use that guiding principle? And anyway, that's for down the road, but it's one key learning that I had. Even though we all represent different funds or different investment rounds, the best boards have the company's interest number one, and then of course, you have that company fiduciary responsibility, and sometimes it may not be the most optimized outcome for your fund in particular, but if it's the right thing for the company, the best board members do that.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And, I'm living more in the public company board, which is very different. But the one thing that's the same is fiduciary responsibility, which Lokesh brought up at the very beginning. It's duty of care and duty of loyalty. And your first responsibility is duty of loyalty and care of the company. And the investment has to come second. And I mean, legally, that's a law, and so I think it's a very interesting balance, because as investors, you have a certain expectation. So you have to look at that. And I actually think having multiple investors like you described, and I haven't personally been in this environment. I've been on the board of a startup with a couple of investor observers, but not to the extent you all have much more experience, obviously. But there's an interesting dynamic with that diversity that helps, I think, the company by having different perspectives. What one might be coming from, one vector or another from another, and to rationalize those could make the company stronger. While it might be frustrating at the time, I don't know. Well, let's talk a little bit about board cadence. And, I think it's really interesting, again, for me, since I've been on the startup and an early stage and then on up to very large company. There's a lot of structure as you get further down the road. What I've seen in a limited space here of my experience on advising and other things and boards is that there has a tendency to be sometimes a little bit too much casualness to the board and the cadence. And there are bylaws that state obligations, like you must hold a shareholder meeting once a year. And there's other things. So I would love to hear each of your perspective on that. And where you've seen it, where it wasn't taken seriously, it can actually cause a lot of problems with communication just in what's happening. And you have all these investors on your board, and yet you're not having regular meetings. So then all of a sudden, I personally had an experience with a board that I've been on that's an early stage, further along than startup. And all of a sudden, the week before the board meeting, it got canceled because they were too busy. And I'm like, oh, I know I take things seriously as a public director. That would never happen. But I take it seriously also on a smaller company. So Kwame, let's start with you. What kind of thoughts do you have in this space? And what do you expect when you get on a board?
Sure. So before I answer that, Kim, I want to go to, again, my bucket 3, which is why, right? Because most of the time when you see that cadence isn't there, it's a function of a mistake that is made at the formation stage. Mm-hmm. Just from the company, and we need officers. I don't have any money and I don't have any officers. So I'm the president, I'm the secretary, I'm the treasurer, right? And then you just file that stuff. And then your attorney is like, yeah, you have to do these quarterly board meetings and you're just signing things and whatever.
Right. Yep.
3 months goes by really fast, right? So 3 months has gone by. We don't have our execs yet. We don't have that stuff filled. And then also, for the most part, nobody's calling you saying, hey, when's your board meeting, right? And so that's where you start to see what I would say kind of unhealthy pattern basically starts. When we go to the why of what the board is and why it's so important, I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't understand what the board actually is. Or it's like, well, it's too early for me to get a board. I just got some friends and family money and I just raised 75 grand, 100 grand. It's too early.
Necessary evil.
Right. And I think it's our job to reframe that. And this is one of the reasons why I go back to them being such an important part of the fundraising, right? Because if you don't really understand the totality of the board, but you understand they're going to help you to raise money, you're going to be working with them closely all the time from the beginning. The other thing that I share with entrepreneurs in my portfolio and ones that we get in, as we're starting the relationship, we've just made the investment. And quite frankly, when we're doing due diligence, because that's when I start to see that, right? Well, who's on the board? And it's not that robust. It's really helpful to raise money down the road because you have 5, 6, 7 board meeting minutes. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So when you don't have these meetings, you don't have the board minutes in place. When you have them in place, it's showing at least 2 things. One, that cadence and responsibility and you're taking it seriously, but also it gives you coverage. So like if I'm looking at the financials and I'm like, why did you spend $700,000 buying this piece of equipment? And they go, well, Mr. Uncle, let me kind of take you back to, this board meeting of last February. This company did this presentation. Our board asked for a formal proposal. The proposal was submitted. We did a side informal board meeting to talk about it. Then they came to present to the board. And then on June 15th, the board voted unanimously. Okay, well, I know Lukesh is on the board. I know Cheryl's on the board. I know Kim is on the board. Now I have the minutes, it's explained. And if all 3 of you guys signed off on it and it was unanimous, I don't really need to get into what that piece of equipment does. I can feel comfortable knowing that was a smart move. Now, at the end of the day, the truth of it might have been the entrepreneur was one really pushing it. I don't know. All I know is that the board had a good process. They all agreed, they voted on it, and we're good to go. Imagine now you're trying to do a Series A and you don't have those board meeting minutes. And you don't have the historical record of why you did certain things, to Lakesh's great phraseology, where the guardrails were there to help you and protect you. And you don't have that. So you're going to miss out on money down the road. And you're doing yourself a disservice by not having that wonderful archive there to be able to show how responsibly you're actually running the business. So it'll help to raise money. That said, It's super simple, Kim. It's the cadence. Like, let's just set not only quarterly, but let's get that stuff on the calendar at the beginning, right? When you look at most of our calendars, they're just packed. We've got 3 or 4 or 5 meetings a day. Clearly, we can schedule 4 over the next 12 months.
That's really important. All the boards I'm on, we have a 2-year schedule and it gets reset at the end of the year for the next 2 years because there's too many things to map out.
I love
Cheryl, what
that.
do you have to say about this topic?
Yeah, I think that it's important to have a regular cadence. You know, I actually, as an entrepreneur, it's a great discipline to do it monthly or bi-monthly because what I've found is that it requires the CEO to kind of pull everything together. And Kim, I know you probably experienced this when you were running SaferLock. You know, you have to pull your marketing, you have to pull your financials, you have to pull it all together in a coherent story and decision-making discussion with your board. And for small companies, as you know, that are moving so fast and have so many things coming at them, the discipline of doing that just for the team to sit down and think about what are the 3 most important things we want to share with the board? What are the, you know, couple big decisions we want to discuss? Is really, really helpful in and of itself, even if you weren't going to sit down with really smart people. So I think having that regular cadence and discipline to do that, and bringing in your team as a CEO, so your key people to you know, discuss topics that in decision making that is going on, whether it's should we sign this customer contract or this customer contract, or you know, is helpful to the team in growing the business.
Yeah. Lokesh, how about you? Do you have any other?
Yeah, the couple of points that I would add to what Kwame and Cheryl said is in the initial stages, a lot of times I would hear an entrepreneur say, oh, you know, how formal do you want this? Do you want me to prepare a deck? You know, how much effort should I be spending on it? It takes me away from my customers and my selling efforts and, you know, all of that. You know, can I really afford to have this monthly, you know, and I spend this much time? And my answer there is that, you know, I've been a CEO before, right, for 2 startups. And I can tell you that unless you are being deliberate about it, you know, you will always just be reacting to things, right? And so in some senses, having a board and the preparation that the CEO spends in that brings focus for them. You know, so it's not for the benefit of the board members, it's almost for the CEO that they get benefit from preparing for the board meeting, because guess what? They had to get an update from their marketing team. They had to get an update from the sales pipeline, from the sales team. They had to get an update from their CFO around their financials. So they had to put some effort in putting that together, right? And so it provides, I think the biggest benefit is to the, you know, the entrepreneur themselves, not to the board from an information standpoint, because it provides them direction and that together, right? So that's one important thing in my mind. And the second thing I find is the CEOs who are good at, you know, and I wasn't that way when I first became a CEO. It took me time to get there. But the CEOs who are good at what they do, they're always thinking in those same terms. This is my 30-day plan. This is my 60-day plan, 90-day plan. So they already, their team meetings, etc., are already structured that way. So when it comes time for preparing for the board meetings, guess what? It's very straightforward for them. It's like, you know, that's already covered in their weekly updates and meetings. And it's just no big deal in putting the board deck together, right? So that's my two additions.
Totally agree. And, you know, you have your strategic plan and you should be tracking it monthly within the operational side of the company, and then quarterly anyways. And it's just a roll up and, you know, looking at the financials, but you better be doing that in the startup even weekly sometimes, right? Yeah. The other point I wanted to just comment on what everyone has said, and also Kwame, the part about having a document and having documented regular meetings, going back to your fiduciary responsibility of duty of care and duty of loyalty, if someone were to sue the company and you can't show that you did your good faith effort and made decisions to the best of your knowledge at that time, and that's where the minutes come in, you can show that you were doing that, then you put the company at risk. So it's even bigger than keeping your investors happy and being a well-run company. It keeps the legal side of what you're doing in check. So all right, well, let's go. I have one more area and then there's a bunch of questions. I'm going to try and get through quite a few of them. I think we're going to answer some of them in the next section. Oh man, this is just really great stuff. So the last area I wanted to cover is just when, as the board is moving along, the board composition starts out one way. So you get investment, you have investors, and it changes over time from founders building the company to, becoming I like to joke as Pinocchio becomes a real boy kind of thing, where, it's really the company is formed and things are happening. And I think there's a lot of, it's a touchy topic. When does the founders stay on the board? When do they not? I mean, we see founders like Zuckerberg still on the board, obviously. I mean, it can be anything, but if you could just share some different things, maybe ways to maneuver that in board comp that you see, I would love to hear your thoughts. Cheryl, why don't we start with you? You're on mute. You're on mute, Cheryl.
Okay,
Oh,
there you go. I had a little trouble with my mute. Yeah, so as people were saying, as you get more investment rounds, right, you're going to add more investors to your board. So you may start out where you have some common investors, and then maybe you have Lokesh or Kwame who's come in as your seed investor. So you may have, a mix, and then you're going to add another investor, and so you're going to, and you kind of want to keep the board to a manageable size. So you might have some of your early seed investors who maybe were friends and family or an advisor who may be on in the beginning, who, as you bring on your Series B investor or Series C investor, you kind of recompose and have more of these institutional investors on board. And then there's the IPO, which is different because a lot of investors, just because, as you know, as you go public, there's just a whole different, liability situation. So then typically when a company will go public, a lot of the what I would call venture investors may be giving up their seats relatively quickly. And so those are kind of the phases that I've seen, kind of the phase from kind of friends and family and your early investor to, a group of investors from A to C to a public, to kind of a public composition. And those are at least the phases that I've seen. And moving people and setting expectations when people come on the board, especially the early stage, that this isn't a forever thing. It's it's probably until we get to a certain stage.
Right.
And I think that professional investors understand when you're going IPO, and most of their funds have policies on what they will and will not do. And strategic investors, like I represented Intel, for a long time, they wouldn't take board seats because of liability. They would take board observer seats. So you would always have a couple of them, but you treat them mostly as board members. They just don't vote. So there's a range of things that happen over this lifespan of, raising money.
Right. And when you go IPO and you become public, there's SEC law around independent directors, and investors are not typically independent at that point. But Lokesh, how about you? And I would love to hear your thoughts, and Kwame as well, on size of the board. Like, do you have staff on the board? Do you have does the C-suite stay on? I think that's always a touchy subject when the board starts getting bigger.
Yeah. So typically, what I have seen is that when we're coming in a seed round, there's a couple of founders and us as the investor, and it's a 3-person board. And again, I mean, there's all kinds of variations, but this is just the most typical that I have seen. And then when you get to the Series A or B, typically the Series A or Series B director gets added, and at that time, and I think answering Liz Tang's question in the chat too, at that time, potentially you have 2 common, including, the founder, CEO, 2 investors, us as the seed, and then whoever came in at the Series A, Series B. But then at that time, the fifth board member can be almost like your independent advisor types that had been helping you. And typically, if your investors are okay with that, that can be the common jointly agreed upon director. So that's your 5-person board. At some point, you do future rounds. The earliest investors typically drop off or become board observers. Unless they've been participating and being very involved from a dollar standpoint in the subsequent rounds. So that's the most typical arrangement that I have seen. The experiences might be different with Kwame or Cheryl. I don't have experience with, IPOs or much later stage companies. So, it's something, we'll learn and grow from in the years to come. That's probably what I would say around the board size, and how I have mostly seen that work.
Okay, great. Kwame?
Yeah, nothing to add there. I think they covered it.
Okay. What about, someone has a question on here about how many boards can a person be on at a time? And I mean, I have an answer for that because but I think it really depends on the situation. But do you, as investors and people on boards, do you have a certain number? Like if you have a group of folks from your fund that go on various boards, I think that's how it works, where you put people in various investments. Is there a number where you say, okay, you're boarded up?
Yeah, I mean, for us on that one is basically it's just a straight function of how many investments we make and how many people we have, right? So we, typically each one of the partners at Moneta is on 5 boards.
Okay.
But it's just a function of that.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. We actually, when I was at Intel Capital, they actually did a study. Like they went to all the venture funds around the Valley and calculated like what was the right, as a good corporate, VC growing would do, what was the right board number? And they came up with the number 6 boards now, which is close to Lokesh's 5.
Yeah.
But what I've seen since then, this was a while back, is a lot of the bigger funds, if you look at their partners, they're in double digits in terms of, and so they're not paying as much attention. And they also rank their investments in quartiles. So if you're in their top quartile, and you're going to get more attention than if you're in their 4th quartile. So they might have a dozen. A partner there may have a dozen. And so it does vary, but I think from Lokesh's perspective and my perspective, if it's early where you are really, helping, I think that 5 to 6 range is probably the right number.
Is that what you've seen, Kwame?
Not really. I mean, I think it's different in terms of numbers because it's a question of what the stage of the company is, right? So like I'm on the board of regents for a university. The university is like 90 years old and there's 21 people on that board. So my role in that, and it's a serious role, right? But what's needed from me is a lot less because it's a 90-year-old institution that has this huge operating budget. There's all these people and I play a very specific role in that situation. So could I have 2 or 3 universities? Sure, right? So I don't think it's as much the number. It's a question of what is that board member doing in those particular places? So for me, it's doing early stage. Like I can't be on 7 because it's so intensive, the help that's needed. And one of the things that we didn't talk about is that oftentimes, particularly when dealing with early stage, we as board members are helping to put out fires, right? And we're helping to solve pretty serious problems. And those problems might be founder disagreements. Those problems may be, off-time cash flow issues, right? And so you don't have the capacity to be able to be putting out fires for all these different companies. So for me, it's really about which stage company are we talking about? Who else is on there? And then also capacity. So like for me personally, my early investors liked the fact that I was on the boards of these companies because it gave them a comfort knowing that, okay, Black Star Fund You guys are doing these investments. Kwame, we know you, we like you, we trust you. And if you're on those boards, that makes us feel better. Now that the fund is maturing, what I'm looking to do is to get board seats on a lot of these investments that we do, but not be serving on that board. Because what I'm also finding too, Kim, is that it's one thing for us as VCs to get a board seat. It's another thing for us to make sure that that seat is filled with the person who can add the most value, right? So if I'm coming in Black Star Fund early, where it's just we're early and you want the Black Star Fund guy, you get Kwame, great. Now it's okay, we're investing $500,000, but I want to get somebody who actually understands the space really well, that you gel with, who can help them solve, help raise money, help provide good guardrails for you, and help give you credibility. Because I have a credibility as the Black Star Fund guy, sure. But if I'm somebody who had 2 exits and I've, I'm a big investor in NFTs, I'd actually be a better board member, right, than the person who's just writing the check if that company, that's what they specialize in. Right. So I think to some extent, it's being at a different stage. We're doing that, but I think it's almost like Lakesh's point earlier. It's like I'm growing, learning, and maturing as an investor. So for me, it's like less even like exciting to be, oh, I'm on the board. It's like, no, I want to make sure you get the best person on the board, right. And a lot of times it's probably not me.
And that's really, it's really true also about what you're doing on the board. If you're the chair of several boards, there's a lot of public companies have bylaws that state you can't be on more than X number of boards. And it's kind of an SEC kind of I don't know if it's an actual law or if it's just a kind of unwritten rule that 4 public boards is the maximum, because, how can you give the attention you need? Plus you could be on, I've known people that have done 4 public boards and 4 private boards, and then it's a scheduling nightmare. But the other thing about getting really boarded up is you also have to look for conflicts. Where is there a conflict of interest? And if you're in an area where you're doing all healthcare X and you're getting boarded on I'm sure the investment funds look at the conflicts too, but you do have to be careful. And then there's the other side of that, which is how can you get on the boards that you can leverage what's going on and one can be helping another. And so I don't think there's one best way, but there's definitely consideration. And then there's also, like, if you're a CEO of a pretty, small to mid-sized company, obviously big company, there's time. And can you really devote the time? And what does it take to have the attention that the company deserves? We have about 10 minutes left, and I think we answered a lot of the questions. Let's see, how do you suggest entrepreneurs vet potential board members for fit and alignment? That's a good question. Yep. And I mean, sometimes obviously there's people that just, they invest the money, they want a board seat, but what kind of thoughts do you guys have on that? Kwame, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say it's super simple and quick. I would say just to think about, at the end of the day, the board members in this particular question and context would be like interviewing teammates and partners. You got to go through just the same process. And one of the best things is that I think is actually underplayed in even just hiring is references, right? And so when you talk about board members, the reality is most of us are serving on multiple boards. So it's like you're talking to other founders that they're on the board. Now, the reality is you only need to hear 2 or 3 stories of like, oh my God, they were amazing. We had a really serious problem. They got on the phone, they did this, they come up with really incredible ideas, they solved problems. And honestly, we've been in a situation where we've had 4 days before it, we were out of money. And the calmness that they had in those meetings was just unbelievable. And it just helped me because I wasn't sleeping. Like when you hear that, you're like, I gotta get this person, right? And of course, I don't have to go into the opposite, right? So, it's that helps in terms of your vetting, you're smart, you started a company, you've raised money, you're getting customers, you have a disposition and an outlook on the world, which is very different than most people. That's what makes you an entrepreneur. Your risk tolerance is really high. So use the same smarts that you're using, looking at your co-founder, looking at your C-suite, looking at your new hires, but use that same process. I like you. I feel good about working with you. I know the value that you bring internally and externally. I've made some phone calls and I love what I hear from people who I know and I like and I trust. And to the point you made earlier, Kim, is not being afraid of people who don't see everything the way that you see it, right? Because there's so much value to people in meetings. And well, let me play devil's advocate, right? So I'll give you one example. Like, when I'm working with founders, there's a kind of a litmus test, and I'll say, how are you protecting yourself from the imminent onslaught of attacks from competitors and from people who are threatened by what you're doing? And when I hear people say things like, well, we don't really have competition and I'm not really afraid of really anything, and I just think, we're going to be able to do it. I'm like, oh my God, like, right? So it could come across as being somewhat contrarian. And why are you, Kwame, Mr. Positive? Why are you focusing on the negative? Because we are in business, which means we are in a brutal game. And if we're not clear that we're in a brutal game, and you're running around here thinking that you don't have to be prepared to be attacked and people coming after you, particularly when you're actually doing well, then we have some work to do. So I might be sharing something with you that you don't want to hear, and I might be sharing something with you that messes with your ego a little bit. But the reason I'm doing that is because I'm here to help you and protect you. So even though we may see things differently, you see, you don't want to be afraid of building a team and building a board with people who are not 100% in alignment with everything that you believe and see. Because one, they'll help you, as I just said, but two, they're giving you a perspective of people outside your bubble who are going to be your customers, partners, and everything else. Yeah, so that's what I would share.
Great. Any other things to add? I want to touch on a good question that Laura had about advisory boards before I do. Any other points here?
I would just say that as it relates to the selecting a board member, it's the same process. For us, it's the process of selecting your VC, right? If you do have the choice of selecting your VC, sometimes you don't. You want their money, right? So you want their money, and you don't have a choice, and you are like, okay, well, that's what I'm going to. This is the only VC who kind of believes in my vision, and that's why I have to take the money, and therefore somebody will be on the board. Understood. But hopefully you have choices, and most of the companies we invest in have lots of choices in terms of who they take the money from. And so in that situation, then the process kind of translates into what Kwame said. Now, which VC, will add the most value, will fit well with my culture, just like you select a team member. At that point, it just, you take it from where Kwame said, right? So that's important to do in that regard. And how will they help me, right? As I grow the company, have they gone through similar experiences? I think those would be the questions I would ask.
Okay. Yeah, we could do a whole panel on board dynamics and ways to be productive in the boardroom. Maybe we'll do that one next, Cameron, because I think it's an art and a science all of its own, and depending on the personalities in the board comp, it can be pretty tricky. Let's finish this last 5 minutes with this question that I think is really good, that Laura gave us a heads up that we haven't covered yet, and that's advisory boards. Cheryl, maybe you could start by just talking the difference between advisory board versus board. I mean, we've done a session on this earlier where I kind of mapped it out, but I'd like to hear your this panel's perspective on that, the key difference.
Right. And so, in my mind, the advisory board it's a different, while they're helping the CEO and the team, it's a different role. It's clearly not a fiduciary role. They don't have to be investors in the company, or are most likely not investors in the company. And you're really looking for people who can help you in different areas, whether that's in technology, whether that's in customer acquisition, whether that's in early credibility with fundraising. And that one of the things that I've seen really work well and kind of we talk to our fourth wave people about is, let's just say you are in a sector, let's just say it's a med tech sector. If you can find an advisor who has grown and sold a med tech company very similar in your space to come on your advisory board, that is worth so much in just across the board, because they have the experience of building and doing what you're setting out to do. So it's just like having a coach in a sports team or anything else you're doing, someone who has learned and played the game and won the game, and having that person and getting their experience and advice and counsel is invaluable. And so I always say, look, see if you can find somebody. And often those people who have been successful are in a give back mode, and they enjoy doing it again. They enjoy sharing their experience. And that's the beauty. That's why I love the tech sector, is because I've seen so many amazing advisory board members do that and come back and help. So that's, and it's not, I've seen there's two approaches. What I just said is a real approach, where you're going to get some commitment from this experienced person to help you. You'll probably give them some stock. That's not why they're going to be doing it, but having them have some compensation is good. It just shows that there's, shared incentive. Then I've seen the approach where, okay, we're just going to have all these faces, and it's going to look good on my deck. And then when you dig in, it's like, well, we met on LinkedIn and I've had a phone call with them, right? And then you've got, they all have impressive backgrounds, but other than looking good on the slide deck, it's not really meaningful, right? Where if you said, I'm working with Kim Box, she's successfully grown, a med tech company. I talk to her, every other week, once a month. I've given her, X number of shares in the company. That's meaningful versus, a collage of faces that maybe you talk to once or twice in your life.
Yeah, totally. And I've seen it done where, as a matter of fact, I have to say my predecessor for Gatekeeper has an amazing set of advisors that meets monthly, because I'm one of them. So I'm in the meeting, and I just like, it's amazing. I mean, a DEA agent, just really specific things that can help the company, and managing it really well. Also, you should have a contract with an advisor. It shouldn't just be a casual conversation. It should be a contract that even if it's one page that says you are obligated to meet 3 times a year, whatever it is. We are out of time, but I have to say this has been amazing. I'm so grateful to the 3 of you and the time that we've taken to talk about this topic that's really important at the early stages of a company that sometimes doesn't get as much thought. So I'm hoping that the folks on the webinar here have really gotten something out of it. So thank you so much for coming. And Cameron, I don't know if I need to turn it over to you to close it out, or.
Yeah, I'll get us out by 1:30, but want to say thank you to all of you as panelists. So thank you, Kim, Cheryl, Kwame, and Lakesh, for spending the afternoon with us and sharing your experience and expertise, and Kim for concluding your 3-part series with us. So it's been fun to talk about startup board development. I did throw in the chat 2 workshops that she led on startup boards. So feel free to tap into those for some of the board mechanics that you had questions on. And it sounds like there could be a potential other workshop coming your way as Kim proposed. But nonetheless, thank you all, and thank you for being here. And we look forward to seeing you at future events throughout the day. We do have a discussion with Mariah Lichtenstern on startup DEI framework, how to unlock new gains through diverse teams. And then there's an angel investing panel with startup SAC in the evening. So check that out if you're interested as an angel investor to learn more about that asset class. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for serving on the Carlson Center board and sharing your experience here. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
All right. Good
Thank
day,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Cameron.